Howdy, with this video, I want to go over the literary fiction terms list that you're going to be using for essay number one. Again, you're just going to be using 5 of these terms somewhere within your essay. You don't have to define these terms. You just need to use them properly somewhere in your essay. Also, some of these you might be familiar with already, so some of these are just kind of big words to ideas you've already known about. A good example is verbal irony. Verbal irony is just when the words say one thing but mean another. You see that quite a bit in Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, particularly when the guy's waving at them and they're just kind of like, oh, he must think we like it out here or something. Using verbal irony as kind of sarcasm and humor. It can be a little more tragic, I guess, in something like The Story of an Hour, where, she died of a love that kills. And obviously the irony is that she died because she suddenly had the shock of losing her freedom when she found out her husband was actually still alive, and that shock killed her. So verbal irony kind of works that way. Dramatic irony, same kind of thing. When the opposite of what you expect to happen happens. And a good example is in The Open Boat, when the strongest person in the boat, the oiler, is the one that doesn't make it to shore. He doesn't survive at the end. And that's a good example of dramatic irony. You kind of expect him to live, but unfortunately he doesn't. It's not always as strong as that survive for some reason. Ambivalence is when you're wavering between two possible meanings. A good example is in religious works, or at least Western religious works. You're generally wavering between two possible meanings within one of these works. You're either going to go to heaven or you're going to burn in hell, right? Excuse me. So that's a dominating thing in something like the Psalms, or something like that, where either you're on the right path going the right way or the wrong path going the wrong way. Another way to think about ambivalence is with a candy bar. You're wavering between two possible meanings. If you eat it, you get the pleasure of eating a candy bar, but then, it's going to put the weight on. The old, minute on the lips is a forever on the hips kind of ambivalent kind of statement there. Ambiguities are slightly different. That's when you have multiple possible meanings creating within a work. A good example is in David Sedaris's Jesus Shaves. You get all these different possible interpretations of Easter. Some people not even understanding even the basics of what's going on there because people can't explain it to them because they're stuck trying to use French. It creates all this funny kind of ambiguity, these different possible meanings. Sometimes ambiguity can be a little more tragic, where you're not quite sure what's happening and what the outcome's going to be. A lot of ambiguity in the Hemingway story, where you probably got done with that and we're kind of like, well, okay then, what exactly happened here? What are they talking about? And Hemingway creates a lot of ambiguity because you kind of just dropped in the middle of the story and got to try and figure things out as you go. Mood and atmosphere, just the emotions that the story brings out. Probably with Hawthorne, being in the lab and Amenadab and the fire and the smells and all this fun stuff. Working with this very gothic kind of mood, where you kind of wonder if things are going to work out at the end, right? Likewise, in The Open Boat, everything's gray. They can't see anything. The ocean isn't pretty to them. You kind of get this very different type of mood from something like you might with Hawthorne. They both spend some time creating the setting and the mood, but they're doing it in much different ways for different effect. Symbolism, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. It's when things represent something else. Universal symbols, generally something that transcends cultures. If somebody's writing about your story and the sun's starting to set, you might have a problem, right? Generally, that's the end of something when the sun's going down, quite often the end of a life. Likewise, the rising sun's a sign of rebirth, right? And that tends to transcend cultures. Conventional cultural symbol, generally specific to a particular culture. There are symbols like an eagle is a conventional symbol for Americans. It means something to us. It means something about our country. To somebody in Bulgaria, the eagle may not mean anything at all. They might not even know what one is. I don't know. I'm not sure of my birds and world birds there, but you see all these different kinds of symbols, and we quite often argue about what different symbols might mean. Football players taking a knee during the national anthem, a very powerful symbol, and people react negatively, people react positively, and we fight about it, right? And try and figure out what's going on there. So just because something might symbolize something doesn't mean we quite all agree what it means and the significance of it. Literary symbol, generally something that's limited to a particular work. Good examples of the little handprints in the birthmark. Little handprints don't have a real significant cultural or universal symbol, but it means a whole lot in that short story. And some of you also pointed out that even though it's a literary symbol, it signifies a universal concept of human beings and how we always want more no matter what we have. And you can trace that back forever, right? Most creation myths have that element of people never being satisfied. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden itself have everything they could possibly want. They want that one thing more, right? That's what human beings are kind of like. So even though the literary symbol may be kind of unique to that short story, it's really pulling in this kind of universal idea. And Hawthorne would have loved that. A lot of you picked up on that. An allegory is when the entire story is symbolic of something else. It's kind of like an Aesop fable or something like that, where all the characters mean something, and the story kind of has a big moral at the end. You kind of see that with the Hawthorne story. A lot of you pointed out, like the moral of the story is be satisfied with what you have. Don't try and reach perfection. That's not what human beings are about. And kind of talked in terms of the Hawthorne short story being this kind of allegory for that idea. Same thing. You don't have to be a romantic to write an allegory. Stephen Crane often writes this way. We're all on this open boat in the big vast ocean of life. And hopefully we're going to rely on each other and help each other through, so some of us can make it to the end, right? So there's an allegorical aspect to the open boat as well, I think. You definitely see that in Stephen Crane's poetry. Anyway, structure. What's the basic format and structure of the short story? Is it told in chronological order? Does it follow the standard pattern of a short story, or are the authors trying to do something much different? You kind of saw with Hemingway, the structure of the story is not what we're used to. We get a little background in the first paragraph, and all of a sudden we're in this conversation and trying to figure out what in the world's going on there. Then it just ends, and you're like, what do I do with this? A very different, modernist, fragmented way of writing, and that's what the modernists want to do. They start playing with the structure of a story, and working with these fragments and creating something new. Likewise, with Jennifer Egan's Black Box, the whole story is structured as a series of tweets, which creates a very fascinating effect as you're trying to piece together these different, tweets into a short story. So some stories kind of operate with a standard structure. Others like to play with structure and do some interesting things with it. Give me 1 second there. With foreshadowing, that's when the author drops hints of what's to come. By the end of the birthmark, Hawthorne dropped enough hints to kind of so that when Georgiana dies at the end, it's not a huge shock. Hope it's a little bit of a shock, but it's not like, oh my gosh, where'd that come from? He'd been kind of preparing us all along for what might happen. And generally, if you go back and reread a short story, you're going to see this foreshadowing coming into play as you read it. A plot, that's what basically happens in the story. If I ask for a plot summary, I'm asking you just to tell me what happened in the story. But I almost never ask for a plot summary. I've read the short story. I know what happens in it. Most English teachers are going to ask you to discuss themes within a short story, which are the broader ideas the author's trying to work with. You notice, like in the open boat, there's certain themes being played out there. One interesting theme is this move away from a religious explanation of the world. And Crane doesn't really deal with that. You kind of see this omission of religion within a short story like The Open Boat. One of the main themes of many realist writers, moving away from this idea of religion explaining the world. And you may respond positively or negatively, but you kind of see that working in some of these works. The theme of the struggle to communicate, very postmodern theme in Sedaris's Jesus Shaves, where everybody's trying to figure out what Easter is, and he's having a lot more fun with it and using it for comedic effect. Uh, Somebody like James Baldwin's going to be getting into racial themes. Faulkner gets into racial themes. One of the warnings I put up there about the essay number 1, he uses the language people used back then. It's very offensive now, but still in the story. So, you got to figure out what you want to do there. But different authors work with different themes, some related to the literary movements we're talking about, some authors developing their own themes throughout a work or throughout a series of works. Excuse me. Protagonist, the main character in the story, the person you're with for the most part. Probably the protagonist in the open boat is probably the journalist. We're with him the most. We're hearing what he's thinking the most. So he's probably the main character. The interesting character question is who's the antagonist? Generally, the antagonist is the second character that's in opposition to the protagonist. So the antagonist in the open boat might just be nature itself, right? You're kind of stuck on this open boat in the middle of the ocean, and you're battling nature and trying to survive and assert yourself in the world, even though the world doesn't seem to care. Could kind of get some interesting questions about those terms. Who's the protagonist in the Hemingway story? Is it the man or the woman? The story is kind of about something the woman's thinking about doing, and sometimes I kind of think she's the protagonist, kind of the main character, with the man kind of being the antagonist and trying to get her to do something without telling her he wants her to do something. So you might go the other way. You might say, no, the man seems to be the main character. We hear more about him. And so that might make the female the antagonist. So some interesting questions there. And you're going to see authors like to play with these different terms and ideas within their writing. So, we try to etch these in stone, but then here comes a writer who wants to play with these ideas. Excuse me. That was a gross sound. A static or flat character, generally a kind of a stereotypical character. If you notice in the open boat, you kind of got the oiler, the cook, the captain, and the journalist. And we don't hear much about the oiler or the cook or the captain. We don't get much background from them. We don't really get a lot about the journalist either, but get a little bit more from him. So they're kind of these stereotypical characters. Sometimes when they're talking, you don't always know who's talking. If you go back and look at some of the longer dialogue sections, it's kind of interesting. And in a way, it's not important. You just know that it's one of the 4 guys on the boat, and they're trying to do their thing. But kind of fairly flat characters. Aminadab's another example of a kind of a stereotypical flat character. He's there. He's serving a function, but he's not really developing as a character. Dynamic or round character is generally a character that changes throughout the story. The journalist might be kind of a dynamic character because at the beginning of the story, we kind of hear that he's been taught to be cynical of men, and you kind of like us, we're kind of a little cynical in this world. But he's going through this unpleasant, terrifying experience. But he also kind of explains that, even though this is a very unpleasant experience, it's also one of the best experiences of his life because for the first time, he's connecting with other people in some way. And by the end, he's kind of learned something about life. And he's might be kind of a dynamic, round character in this short story that realists tend to go towards a more static, flat character sometimes to make a point. A sympathetic character is a character you tend to identify with or empathize with. Kind of depends on the reader there. The Hemingway story is kind of interesting. I kind of feel for the woman who's kind of stuck in a weird situation, and you got this guy who's kind of he's not the nice. Doesn't seem to me to be the nicest guy in the world. So I might feel a little bit for the woman in the short story. A different reader may feel differently, right? It kind of depends on who you are and what kind of things you're empathetic towards. Point of view. Who's telling the story? Do you have a first-person narrator using I? I did this, I did that. The Jesus Shaves is told in first person with the I there. So is Sonny's Blues. It's told with a first-person narrator. Edgar Allan Poe loves to use these first-person narrators. And one question you start getting with Poe first-person narrators is how reliable they are. One of your choices for essay number 1 is the Cask of Amontillado, and you're going to find pretty quickly that the first-person narrator is a little bit insane. But the problem is relying on this first-person narrator for all the information in the story. And so you got to kind of reconcile what you're being told with the emerging insanity of the narrator. And Poe loves to do that. And it creates just a fascinating effect. Something like Jesus Saves, maybe the narrator might be a little bit more reliable, but he's also kind of carefree about some of the themes that's going on within the short story, and kind of interesting at the end there. Also, the other question about first-person narrators is how much they're participating within the story they're telling. Some are very much participating within the story, like in Jesus Saves. Others might be a little more detached and kind of using first-person narration, but kind of keeping the events kind of a little bit away from them. Either way can produce a very interesting effect in a short story. Third-person narrator, talking about he did this, she did that, they did this. And kind of sometimes a third-person narrator could just be kind of a fly on the wall, just telling the events that are happening kind of in front of them, so to speak. Sometimes a third-person narrator can be omniscient, that can go inside people's minds and tell you what they're thinking, then go over here and go to these different places and tell you everything that's kind of happening in the story. Quite often, an author chooses limited omniscience, which means the third-person narrator may not know everything or may not be willing to tell you everything. Sometimes Hawthorne likes to play with this limited omniscience with third-person narrators, where sometimes the narrator just kind of pulls back and doesn't always tell you everything you might want to know within a story, which can create ambiguity and, a very interesting effect sometimes. The settings, just where the story is taking place. It can refer to the setting and time, the setting and location, psychologically what's happening within the story. Some authors are very focused on a very particular place and very particular time. If you ever read something from Mark Twain, he's going to put you in a very specific place, whether it's on the Mississippi or in California or wherever. Probably someplace he's been, and he's got to write authoritatively about that particular setting. Kate Chopin's very focused on the Bayou region of Louisiana. Don't quite get this in the story of an hour. It's too short for her to do that. But if you read any of her novel or any of her other short stories, you're going to hear characters talking with the Bayou accent and all this interesting stuff about Louisiana. Realists want to put you in a very specific physical setting. A romantic like Hawthorne kind of takes you to this fantasy land where something's kind of happened, a few years ago in a place unnamed. But he does spend a lot of time talking about what a room looks like or what a lab looks like. The inside of the place is more interesting to him than the geographical location. Settings can be very fascinating, particularly why authors choose particular settings, particularly also in particular moments in time. Faulkner is very focused on one county in Mississippi where Jefferson's the county seat, the city of Jefferson, and all his novels and everything, all his short stories happen within this one county. That's or most of them do, maybe not all of them, but it's very fascinating how he creates his own little world in a very small area, but this huge expanse of novels. Anyway, our last one, style. Kind of the question is, what makes Poe Poe, or what makes Hawthorne Hawthorne, or Flannery O'Connor, or David Sedaris. How's the author developing a certain style within a particular work or within a series of works? David Sedaris is known for his comedy, for his humor, and these kind of postmodern themes where the world's kind of this silly effort at making meaning, and it creates a very interesting effect within his short stories. Flannery O'Connor, one of your choices for essay number 1, is known for her dark, grotesque sense of humor. And you can see it running through all her all their works. She also deals with themes of existentialism, quite often rejecting many of the ideas of existentialism, but still working with them through their characters. And it creates a very interesting philosophical kind of area for her to examine ideas. Hawthorne kind of notices very long, complex sentence structure. He pulls out he unpacks all his adjectives, and just reading him, you get a few more vocabulary words, right? Crane, on the other hand, kind of wants a more plain style, if you will. He's got a point to make, and he's going to make it as clearly as he can. So very, very interesting. What kind of symbolism do authors like to get into? Is it or very complex, and you've got to kind of unpack everything, or is it pretty straightforward? The story of an hour, as she's having her awakening, the sun shines, the clouds part, the birds sing. Not a lot of complex symbolism. She's trying to get to a more specific point there, right? So style is just kind of the catch-all term we use when we're talking about writers and with their short stories. I think that's about it. I know I went through these very quickly. Again, I'm not expecting you to define these within your essay. I'm expecting you to use them properly within your essay, because when you write about literature, you want to use some of these terms and use them with some authority. If you have any questions about them, be sure to let me know, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.